Hello, I'm Ole, and welcome back to the second part of Theories and Principles of Priority Setting. In the first session, I asked you to think about this example on evaluating health outcomes. So I asked you to think about whether a utilitarian would recommend 10 extra healthy life years or QALYs to group 1 with a better life expectancy than this group with a lower life expectancy. And the answer here, and this is a bit technical, health economists would say that policymakers should be indifferent between these choices. They are equally good. Each option will maximize health. It will add 10 life years. And utilitarianism and the way it's applied in health economics and cost per QALY analysis, they don't look at the baseline and whether some people are worse off than others. They only look at improvements at the margin. So a utilitarian who wants to maximize health would be indifferent. They are equally good. So this is important for understanding some of the critique of utilitarianism. And I'll bring in egalitarianism. These are a family of theories focusing on equality, on equal access to health services, to non-discrimination, and to equal outcomes. And I really recommend to read papers or book by the Indian philosopher Amartya Sen. He was also an economist and got the Nobel Prize in economics. And he has written a fantastic book called Development as Freedom, that I recommend strongly, and also a paper on what is health equity, and a broader theory of justice called the idea of justice. And I have a quote from him here. Sen says that utilitarianism is supremely unconcerned with the interpersonal distribution. And that's exactly the point I illustrated in the example. Utilitarianism does not care about the level or the distribution of health, only how to maximize it, or utility. So Sen has been, he has criticized utilitarianism in a lot of his writing. In one of the papers that we asked you to read, we have a table where we are discussing acceptable criteria for priority setting, criteria that every ethical theory would accept, and some contested criteria, and this list of unacceptable criteria. And this is relevant to understand because the idea here is that no ethical theory would recommend that policymakers or clinicians, health professionals, make priorities looking at gender or race or ethnicity. We should be blind to these characteristics of people, what kind of religion they have, sexual orientation, the social status, and area of residence. And this is important because in priority setting in practice, we often violate this list of unacceptable criteria. There's a lot of discrimination, explicit or implicit, in priority setting. So a lot of work on ethics and priority setting is about to analyzing and looking and checking that we don't discriminate in priority setting. So please read this paper and read the discussion of these criteria. A little bit more about egalitarianism and Sen's paper, Why Health Equity. So equity is a much more complex, or egalitarianism, a much more complex theory compared to utilitarianism that just have kind of one principle, one slogan. So equity, according to Amartya Sen, is a multidimensional concept. It's all about concerns about achievement, about outcomes, but also the capability to achieve good health. And that means freedom of choice. So Sen tries to bring back some of these ideas from liberalism about freedom, autonomy, and freedom of choice. He also wants to include the freedom and the opportunity to participate in the processes of decision making. So people should not be only recipients of health services or of health, they should also be agents. And he focused a lot on non-discrimination. There should be equal access regardless of ethnicity or, for example, sexual orientation. And this means that when we think about equity in health, it needs to be integrated also in the larger framework of theories of justice, because also the determinants of health, how political rights, how income, how property is distributed, and that also affects health. So Sen's work is worth reading, a much more complex but also much more interesting approach to these hard choices of priority setting in health, in my view. I also want to introduce briefly an ethical theory called prioritarianism, which seeks in a way to combine utilitarianism and egalitarianism, and especially in the space of health outcomes. So prioritarianism is a consequentialist ethical theory. And the principle here is that decision makers should aim to maximize health or well-being with extra priority to the worse off. And in this sense, you take into consideration both how much you can improve health, but also looking at who are worse off, and is it possible to level up. So these two principles, in a way, are combined into one principle in prioritarianism. And this theory and this principle, in a way, responds to the lack of sensitivity to distributional issues in utilitarianism. So I find this a very attractive ethical framework, and it's been a lot of work trying to quantify and do quantitative analysis based on this ethical framework. So here is a slightly adjusted example. Again, we have these two groups. Think about this group as better off than this group that can only expect 56 healthy life years. Suppose again that you have two equally costly interventions. One can add 8 QALYs to the worse off, and the other option is to add 10 QALYs to the better off. And in this case, a utilitarian or by cost per QALY analysis would say that we should choose this policy that maximize health. While a prioritarian, if he was also concerned about the worse off, would argue that the value of 8 life years or quality adjusted life years to this group is higher than 10 for the other group. So in this way, it's possible to add weights and special priorities, special weight to the worse off, and then arrive at the judgment what is the best thing to do. So this is one example illustrating the thinking and the principles in prioritarianism. And this is illustrated for those of you who like to think in mathematics and in graphs. So people with worse health, this is health on the x-axis and social welfare on the y-axis. And this is a transformation curve. So it's possible to quantify the value of improvements. So the same improvement here for the two groups, these are worse off than these, will, because this curve has decreasing marginal, the shape of the curve shows decreasing marginal value of health. The same change gives more value for the worse off compared to the better off. And this is applied in what is called social welfare analysis. So even if the utility gain is the same, social welfare, what it means for society, is better if we give extra priority to the worse off. Let me then talk about more directly how these ways of thinking applies to priority setting. And I was fortunate to chair a group of ethicists and economists and one human rights lawyer that was asked to give advice to the World Health Organization on how to set priorities on the path to universal health coverage. And we argue that the first step would be to set priorities. Many low-income countries cannot achieve universal health care at once, so starting by setting priorities, dividing services, whether they are treatment or prevention or public health interventions, into some that should have high priority, some medium, and some low priority. And that would be important to start thinking about how to move towards universal health coverage. And we recommended, after a lot of discussion, the criteria for priority setting that policymakers could use, and also people working on analysis. Everyone agrees that cost effectiveness, looking at the methods, the data that can help us improve health as much as possible, to maximize health. Everyone argued that that is a necessary criterion and it's important. But we also argue that one should also look at priority to the worse off. And the worse off in this report was defined either as those that are poor and have poor health, or simply those who have poor health. So there are at least two ways to define the worse off. And we also added a third criterion, taking the wider determinants of health into account, and one important aspect of well-being, and that is your income or the household income. Some services can push people into poverty or reduce their income. So therefore we also argue that looking at financial risk protection, if as person have to buy and pay for these services if it's not given priority, and if it's a very costly service, you might be pushed into poverty. So that means that analysts and policymakers have to balance these three criterion. So all are important, and there is no principled way to say which one is most important. So we have to balance these three criterion. And we also argue, it's not easy to read, but you need a fair process, a fair and legitimate process to then use these criteria to classify services into high, medium, and low priority. And when countries try to implement new services, pooling more resources and expanding the range of services, they should start with the high priority services. So here you can see that in a way we recommended a combination of utilitarian and egalitarian principles and criteria. And this was a consensus among different types of ethicists. So there is overlapping agreement on what is important for priority setting. And this, in a way, illustrates that we are concerned about the level of health. We want as much health as possible, but we also need to be concerned about the distribution of health, who are worse off than others, and the distribution of income. Especially the poor need financial risk protection. So let me summarize in two final slides. Going back to the first lecture, about rights and the different theories in ethics. Both rights-based theories and utilitarian theories builds on a respect for citizen preferences. Freedom of choice, we should respect what people really want. We should respect rights. And utilitarianism is concerned about improving or to maximize health and well-being, but with a concern for equality or priority to the worst off, we should aim to reduce unfair inequalities in health or well-being. And both, and especially the rights-based theories and the liberal egalitarian theories, are also concerned about the process of priority setting, the right and the opportunity to participate in decision-making that affect our own lives. And everyone is concerned about health, so all these decisions are relevant for all citizens in a country. My second summary recommends the more applied criteria and for priority setting. Remember that WHO report Making Fair Choices on the Path to UHC recommended to look at cost effectiveness, priority to the worst off, and financial risk protection. And this is based on a kind of agreement from ethical theory when it's applied to priority setting in health. I would say most ethical theories would support these two or three views. It's important to improve or maximize health and well-being, but it's also important to reduce unfair inequalities and health and well-being. And a combination of these two are often what you see in policy documents on priority setting. Most guidelines on priority setting today recommend these two key principles. We should improve health as much as possible while reducing health inequities. And this concludes my talk. Thank you.